This is Homebrew number 21, sneaking it in just before Christmas, and this is a VIMTO Turbo Cider. I've been a fan of turbo ciders for quite some time. In fact, more recently I'm also a fan of normal, fresh apple ciders. But one of the things I've always wanted to try is definitely a VIMTO Turbo Cider. And so this is probably going to be quite a quick one as we spin through all of the steps to produce a VIMTO Turbo Cider. Stay tuned, like and subscribe. Thank you. The ingredients are pretty simple. So 4 litres of apple juice, of course. We've got some Safale S04, which is the yeast that we're going to use. I'll explain why later. I've got some Fermaid-O, which is a yeast nutrient. And of course, the main event, some VIMTO real fruit squash. And finally, we've got a couple of tea bags. Now, in addition to all of that, we may also need some brewer's sugar if we want to bring up the gravity. One of the things when you're doing a turbo cider that you're often told is to look out for preservatives. Now, this VIMTO squash does have preservatives in. It has potassium sorbate, sodium benzoate, and all the sorts of things that you don't particularly want. Now, one of the things that you sort of find is people don't do anything about that, and all that means typically is because it's diluted down with the apple juice, it just means the fermentation is a little slower. But one of the things you can do is just boil it for 10 minutes. And that is the first step that we're going to go through. We're going to take our VIMTO and we're going to boil it up. One litre of VIMTO. Now I'll be honest, the smell of boiling VIMTO is delicious. Assuming you like VIMTO, of course. ,200 grams of brewing sugar to dissolve fairly easily in this. ,10 minutes are up, so that can come off, start to cool down, and I'm going to steep 2 tea bags in that while that cools down. Just going to leave that alone for 15 minutes. While the VIMTO's cooling down, we can start to add some of the apple juice to the fermenter. I'm always interested to see what the apple juice is just by itself, so I'm going to take a hydrometer reading just of the apple juice. I do have some left. I'm going to stop there because I want to add that first. Right, let's take a hydrometer reading of the apple juice. The hydrometer reading is around 1046, almost 1048. And one of the things that has been interesting about store-bought apple juice is I have seen it a lot lower than that. So that's quite interesting that we are probably in a good range already. while we're waiting, it feels like a good opportunity for a raspberry wheat beer. I'm quite sort of a new convert to some of the Belgian beers, and this was an interesting sort of pack that I bought, or ingredients pack that I bought. The aroma of it was amazing, and it still is retaining a good proportion of that that raspberry aroma. The colour and the carbonation too really worked out really well. My only problem was I did suffer quite a lot with the sediment from the raspberries, but the end result, particularly for those that I bottled at the end, fab. Certainly carbonation worked out. I counter pressure bottle filled. It's been 15 minutes, so to help with the right temperature for pitching the yeast, I'm just going to bring the temperature of this down just a little bit further, and then everything should match up and we can pitch the yeast straight away. Of course, the alternative was to put this into the fermenter and just leave it for a little while just to normalise to room temperature. Both is a reasonable option. With a bit of cooling, we've got this down to just below 22 degrees, which is fine. So I'm just going to take the tea bags out. Adding the VIMTO and tea mix. It's almost exactly where I want it. However, I'm going to add a little bit more because I'm going to take some out to do a hydrometer reading. Next step is to give it a good old mix. This aerates it as well as make sure we've got it all mixed up correctly. It's also my monthly exercise regime. Quick temperature check. Actually, having mixed the two, it's down to 17 degrees. I might need it to warm up a bit before I do the hydrometer reading. That is a bizarre turn of events. Well, I suppose it does demonstrate the benefit of taking a temperature reading. Turns out the apple juice was a little cooler in the fridge than I expected. Oh well. For a hydrometer reading and for the yeast, 20 degrees is about what we're looking for. So I am actually going to pause for a moment and let that warm up a little. While that's warming up, let me just talk for a moment about the yeast. The classic cider yeast is a champagne yeast, which gives you quite a dry result, but gives you a good alcohol kick. I've had surprising success using an ale yeast, which does bring out more fruity flavours successfully, so I've used that before. This time I'm going for something somewhere in the middle. It is still an ale yeast, but it is a fairly high attenuation ale yeast, so we should get a good amount of alcohol content, ABV content out of that. However, I'm expecting it to be more of the VIMTO flavour than the flavour from the yeast. So hence, I am going to go with the Safale S04. Number of reasons for this. One is it's always good to try something new. It seems to fit what we're doing here. And also I conveniently had some lying around that I wanted to use up. So all of these factors played into my final choice of yeast. We'll see how that goes. Meanwhile, the temperature hasn't really changed very much at all. So I think I'm going to go and watch myself an episode of something and come back. So back here in about an hour. We have reached 20 degrees. So for our hydrometer reading, at least we're ready to move on. I do like the colour, and let's hope it keeps that type of colour. Those bubbles are a nuisance. It's 158, but to be sure, I'm going to zoom in with the camera. The temperature on the top is still giving me 15 degrees, and funny enough, this temperature gauge I've got on the side as well is showing, 12 moving to 14 degrees, and you can feel how cold it is from the apple juice from the fridge. So I do think it's going to be a few hours before this is going to be ready for the next step. So I'll check again later, otherwise this may be tomorrow before we pitch the yeast and put in the airlock. So we finally have some news. The temperature's gone up to somewhere between 16 and 18 degrees. And you can sort of see also here on the outside, it's around the 16 degree mark. Now, actually, if we read the information on the Safale S04 packet, good for them for putting all of this information on the packet, it does say temperature range ideally 15 to 20 degrees centigrade. So we're now in the correct operating range anyway. So I think we're good to pitch the yeast. And I'll give it another shake, that'll warm it up a bit too, albeit probably not a whole degree. But there was some other information on here that's probably worth a mention. So characteristics: English ale yeast selected for its fast fermentation profile produces a balanced fruity and floral notes. So again, fits quite well with a cider. I do remember from using this yeast before, it was pretty fast. What it also says, sedimentation is high, so that's good. It's effectively the sedimentation it produces should sort of drop to the bottom. Final gravity is medium. Again, that's good. We don't want it to dry out to the uber percentage, so we just sort of have sandpaper. We want something with some of those flavors coming through. So for all of these reasons, this was always a good choice of yeast. You can tell I've been shaking it up in the interim that I've been away, but effectively we want to just make sure that's all mixed in and also suitably aerated, so that will help the yeast along. Here is my dry, also sterilized funnel. So we're going to pitch in 3 grams of yeast. What I also have here is 5 grams of Fermaid-O. Fermaid-O is a yeast nutrient that will just give it the nourishment it needs to help it get started. It contains a multitude of different benefits for yeast, all in one happy packet. So we're going to pop that in there, 5 grams of Fermaid-O. Now that's going to sit on the top, you can see that there. I'm going to give it a bit of a swish just to make sure all of that actually mixes in. The very last step then before we put this away is to just pop in the airlock. VIMTO Turbo Cider fermentation stages begin. This is 8 hours later. Not much change so far. 18 hours in, occasional bubble. Go on. Day 4, starting to see a little bit of action, not a lot of physical change. Day 5. The occasional bubble, still. Not much colour change, a bit of lease. I've given it a little swish to try and give it a bit more encouragement. Day 10. Day 16, slowly. Effectively every 30 seconds or so we get a bubble, so that's still happening. It's so dark we can't really see anything in there. There's really not very much been happening at the top, but we do have some leaves formed at the bottom. Welcome to day 34. Yes, it's been over a month since we started the VIMTO Turbo Cider. Things have finally quietened down after very slow fermentation. At one point around day 20, I was actually timing the time between each of the bubbles to see if it was changing, and it was changing very slowly day to day. It does finally seem to have quietened down. So before I move this to the keg to start carbonating, I am going to start by doing a hydrometer reading. So that has dried out quite a lot, so that's 1.004. The keg has been chilling with friends. Now, carbonation can of course be done in the bottle. So bottle carbonation is a choice. That's simply adding 3.5 grams of sugar to each 500 milliliter bottle. However, I'm going to carbonate in the keg. A couple of reasons. One is I can also serve from the keg, and then later on I can also do counter pressure bottle filling, and that actually prevents there being any sediment in the bottom of the bottles. Our first step, really, just to give ourselves a little bit of CO2 protection, is to load the keg with a bit of CO2. There's just a tiny amount of pressure coming from the CO2 here. It should push the oxygen to the top. That pushes out the oxygen. This is now full of CO2. Now I'm going to take the top off, so that's going to escape. But the thing is, CO2 is heavier than air, so it should stay at the bottom, and as we siphon in, gives us a protection from air as we go through the siphoning activity. Everything you see here has been sanitized, so the siphon, the keg, has all been sanitized prior to us starting this activity. I haven't put that all the way in. I want to try and avoid as much as I can of this lease at the bottom. It is going to be a little unavoidable. I'm sure I'll pick up a little bit. So that's shy of 10 psi. Again, we've probably still got some air trapped at the top, so I am going to use a pressure release valve to try and let some of that out. Now I salvaged a little bit just to have a try. Funny enough, it does smell quite alcoholic. Now this is not carbonated. This is going to be quite dry, in fact. Oh, but what a fabulous taste. I am glad I've tried this. So it's definitely still sweet, despite being down to 1.002. That's presumably the VIMTO. It definitely has that VIMTO taste to it, which is delicious. A little carbonation and this will be fab. Right, we're all tidied up. So what I'm going to do, just to help get this started, is to do a little bit of forced carbonation. Now actually, I am going to just stick it in the fridge for the most of the time to try and get some carbonation in there, but just to get it started, one of the things we can do is turn up the PSI just a little bit, put it on its side, which gives it a maximum amount of surface area to sort of interact between the liquid and the CO2, and then we can actually start to rock it, and that agitation helps to carbonate. So step one, we're currently running, as I said, just below 10 psi, so I am going to just up that a little bit. So we're up to 15 psi. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to protect the regulator though. So when I lay it down, I'm going to make sure the regulator is on the upside to reduce the risk of liquid going down that tube. And now all we need to do is give it a rock. I don't know if you heard that. That is the CO2 bubbling in. Because as it's absorbed some of the CO2, more has to go in to replace it. Right, I'm going to do this for 5 minutes. This can go in the fridge, back in about 5 to 6 days. So this has been in the fridge carbonating for just 6 days now. Now the pressure on this is still sort of sitting there at around 13 to 14 psi. So I'm going to bring that down just a smidge so that we can sort of serve it. That should have given us the type of carbonation that we're looking for. So this is a test of the VIMTO Turbo Cider. Oh, I'm so excited. So first I'm just going to bring the pressure down a bit. Now I do like this regulator. It's slightly different to the other mini regulators that I've got. So some of the other mini regulators, which look a bit like this, first of all, there's been 2 problems with them. The first is the connection here to the CO2 is starting to wear a bit. So you lose a little bit when you screw it in now, which didn't happen at the beginning. But most importantly, when you reduce the pressure, it doesn't really change anything unless you release the pressure from the keg. And so you generally have to turn it down, guess, release a bit of pressure and see where you are. With this regulator, it's totally different. And what I've been able to do is just release a bit of pressure down, watch the gauge come down as I've released that pressure. And actually here we are exactly at 10 psi. And I'm able to just sort of take it from there. So some of these mini regulators are very different. Now this regulator also came with the tap. It was part of the system that I got here, and I haven't seen this one as a separate item. But yeah, not all mini regulators are made equally. At the moment, flow control is off, so nothing should come out, but I'm just going to make sure the tap is working okay. That's it. This has sometimes been a bit stiff, no problem at the moment, so that's all good. Right, let's try. There we go. Wow, I am very much looking forward to this one. No surprises, it's a bit of a dark fruit VIMTO type aroma. Oh, let's go straight in there. Back in my youth, there were Alco Pops, which were alcoholic drinks that you could drink like lemonade because they tasted so good. This would definitely have fallen into the Alco Pops category. It's delicious. It is clearly a cider. It's clearly VIMTO. It's got a little bit of cold carbonation in there. Oh God, this is so good. If you haven't tried a VIMTO cider, do one now. Delicious. I'm also loving that colour. It's absolutely great, isn't it? Well, I can't enthuse enough about how good a VIMTO cider really is. This is really not going to last very long. we've reached the stage where we're going to start thinking about lessons learned. And my first lesson learned is also my evaluation, which is, my goodness, VIMTO Turbo Cider is fabulous. Do try it. If you're a fan of the VIMTO taste, those dark fruits really come through. And the mouthfeel is wonderful. And with a little carbonation that we've got here, it's got that perfect level of fizz. I am going to do a VIMTO Turbo Cider again. We never made it to the bottle because I drank it all before it got there. That is proof how good it was. Moving on to lesson 2. And lesson 2 was about the fermentation times. The fermentation did take a lot longer than expected, especially since I knew there were preservatives in the VIMTO to begin with. And to try and avoid that problem, I actually boiled the VIMTO at the very start. This did not seem to have the desired effect to remove the preservatives, and therefore fermentation should have started straight away. Fermentation did take quite a long time. It did no harm, the end result was fantastic, but it did take longer to get through to its final gravity than I did expect. The third and final lesson is about carbonation. Now, I've looked at carbonation charts before, and I've looked at them as far as putting them into the Mini-Keg, and the Mini-Keg works great for carbonation, so all is good. But I have been winging it, that's the truth. And this time I was determined to figure out what I was doing wrong. Well, the approach I've been taking has been forced carbonation, which is forcing CO2 into whatever drink it is just to give it a good start, and therefore you can usually drink it within a couple of days, theoretically within the same day. However, the set and wait method is about sort of looking at the temperature, looking at the pressure, and literally setting that, and then waiting for several days for it to carbonate. This is a slow, steady carbonation method, and actually in practice this is the one I've used most of the time because I've rarely leapt in to drink it straight away. So my little bit of forced carbonation at the front does get the whole sort of show on the road, but I have been then going through the carbonation a little bit too high a pressure, and that's the winging it bit. So effectively the temperature in my fridge is roughly 10 degrees. So I can look along the 10 degrees centigrade line, look at the number of CO2 volumes that I'm looking for, and that's the pressure I need to set it at, which is generally quite low, lower than I have been setting it, that being the point. And actually I could have set it around the sort of between 8 and 10 mark rather than the sort of much higher 15 to 20 mark that I've been using. So effectively the slow method does take time, several days, maybe 2 weeks. That's fine. And the pressure, the PSI that you set it to, actually was much lower than the one I have been using on previous brews. So now I get it, I understand the principle of it, so I will apply that logic more frequently in the future and not run the risk of over-carbonation. I seem to have been a bit lucky so far. That's it for the VIMTO Cider, so please do like and subscribe. Thank you very much for watching, and cheers, good health, happy homebrewing.